Okay, in this video, we're going to give our brains a little rest by covering two quick, easy, short concepts, and then we'll wrap up before we move on to part three. So let's begin with pessimistic bias. Although we as humans may prefer pleasant experiences, our brains are actually wired with a subconscious negativity bias when it comes to pulling up memory. Although helpful to our primitive ancestors for survival, it also makes the brain less skilled at learning from positive experience or even remembering them. As neurologist Rick Hansen describes, our brains are like Teflon for the good and Velcro for the bad. This is why we often dwell on hurt feelings and remember negative feedback for a long time, and why we quickly forget compliments, even when they factually outnumber the criticism. So if your partner tends to forget all the nice things that you've done and seems to focus only on the negative stuff, it's the natural tendency of the brain. Now, although this primitive default system is a quicker way to learn, I'm sure we've all learned from some pretty powerful lessons out of some pretty negative experiences, right? This negative bias makes us vulnerable to anxiety, stress, and chronic disappointment. But fortunately, this is one brain characteristic that can be consciously retrained. And with time and practice, you can change your brain into one that more frequently notices the positive aspects of your life. Okay, let's move on. See, I told you they'd be quick and easy. We're on to neuroplasticity. This is one of the most exciting parts of our brain. Neuroplasticity is the ability for the brain to reorganize itself, the ability to form new connections and pathways, the ability to compensate for injuries and adjust its response to new situations and environments. We go through a huge surge of neuroplastic reorganization in the first years of our life, as brain neurons constantly activate and fuse together or start talking to each other, while others are being kind of pruned out or weakened from lack of use. Until about 15 years ago, it was believed that our brain's ability to change like this peaked at age 25 and slowly declined after that. Thankfully, this view has been reversed with current research, which shows that brain change is possible all throughout our life. Developing our ability to self-regulate is also called self-directed neuroplasticity by psychiatrist Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz. And this ability to reorganize really is the key to breaking free from unwanted habitual thinking and behaving patterns. But it requires patience and repetition as the new pathways build. Depending on how long some of your patterns have been running, they become super myelinated, which just means that they become sort of like a superhighway that have a sort of a slick coating on it that makes the chemical signals travel faster from one to the other. And when we build new pathways, it's sort of like bushwhacking or blazing a new trail through a thick forest, but right alongside that superhighway. And it's incredibly tempting for your brain when the trailblazing gets hard, or if you skip a day, to just want to jump back on that super fast, familiar, more efficient pathway. But if you allow your brain to do that, then you have to go back and start the new trail building and start cutting in new trail again. However, if you understand that the initial discomfort of kind of building a new brain pathway is natural and you stick with it, the easier it gets. And then that new trail or pathway becomes myelinated too, and it starts sending new signals faster. So if you can consistently stick through the initial natural discomfort that comes with change without falling back on old patterns, that old superhighway, like from lack of use, starts to get kind of grown over, or in brain terms, it prunes back, weakens, and your new pathways become the preferred superhighways. So let's wrap up these first couple of sections, in first part one and part two, with some general concepts so that when we get to the next set of videos, we can move on to the specific brain areas that we can influence and then see how everything works together as a whole. The summary concept that I want you to take away so far is that our brains are meaning-making machines, but sometimes they don't always get it right. From the moment we're born until the day we die, our brains are constantly interpreting our experiences and then doing its best to assign a meaning to them. This is how we learn to operate in the world. It's how we learn to make decisions and choose behaviors, most of which become habitual and unconscious. Even before we can speak, our brains are picking up sensory signals and assigning an infantile meaning or interpretation to the entire experience. As you learned earlier today, part of this description label we call feeling. And considering the multitude of experiences that we can have, each one paired with an emotional response in different amounts and in different combinations with other body chemicals, gosh, you can see why we humans have a long list of feelings, right? The complicating part is that when we're born, our brains are not fully developed. The right hemisphere, which is dedicated more to sensory interpretation, imagination, creativity, and bonding, is more developed than the left hemisphere, which means children don't develop the ability to reason or separate out fact from non-fact until sometime after the age of 7 or 8. This is why they rely on parents or caregivers with their fully developed brains to do it for them. Now, in a perfect world, parents would be present for and catch every experience a child has, ensuring our infantile brains put an accurate, comprehensive, or factual meaning onto everything. But this doesn't happen. No parent is perfect, and there's no way to catch every experience that a child has. So more times than we know, the meaning or interpretation of an experience got generated from a child's still developing brain. And then it got locked into a repeating loop. And sometimes the interpretation was grossly inaccurate. And if the emotional response in that loop creation was a strong one, like either a painful or a pleasurable emotional response was tied to it, it becomes sticky. And that feedback loop or pattern gets powerful reinforcement in memory. And then over time and with repetition, that loop gets put into long-term unconscious memory to run more automatically, efficiently, and with less energy, even if the assigned meaning was immature, illogical, or just completely wrong. This memorized feedback loop, when repeated enough times without interruption or without a challenge, becomes what we call a belief. Here's the takeaway. Our brains are a product of habitual conditioning, much of which is beyond our conscious awareness. And as children, our still developing brains often came to inaccurate conclusions that were fed into a repeating self-reinforcing pattern. This includes what we refer to as our belief system about the world and ourselves. And quite often, it's not even based on fact. And as we'll learn in the last section, in order to counter this conditioning with supportive beliefs, but without weakening our brain with another conditioned habit, we have to learn to incorporate a diverse set of strategies that help us wean off our familiar unwanted patterns by gently replacing our gratification needs in healthy, moderate ways, as well as strategies that help us work through the natural discomfort that comes with the change of any kind. In parts 3 and 4, we're going to talk more about what kinds of meanings or experience labels our child brains are more likely to develop and why, and how some of the most unhelpful beliefs, even though they're no longer working for us now, were actually helpful to us earlier in our life. They were relevant at one time, and now they are no longer relevant. We've outgrown them, and our brain hasn't been updated to that fact. We'll also talk about the 6 key areas that I've found to be trainable, then see how everything works together as a system. And then finally, we'll take a look at the differences between healthy stress response, unwanted pattern creation, and trauma response. But in the meantime, I have another easy homework assignment for this last section that I want you to consider. And it's simply this. Whenever you sense your body getting upset or activated, I want you to repeat these 2 phrases either out loud or inside to yourself. And they're this. Number 1 is, something's different, or something's happening differently than I expected. And this is highly uncomfortable, but it won't kill me. I want you to remind yourself of those 2 statements. These are 2 neutral, non-judgmental acknowledgments of what you're experiencing and what your body is signaling you about. Now, if you want a 3rd phrase that I've incorporated into my life, it's the phrase, how interesting, like in a curious sort of way. I mean, in actuality, our body's response, the way other people respond, all the perceptual and behavioral intricacies of our life, it really is, at the most basic level, interesting, right? Okay, see you in part 3.